You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, in May of 2019, so over 2 years ago, we recorded an episode called Selling to Clients with In-House Resources. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to go deeper into that. I'm going to interview you on your suggested topic here, your 4 advantages over an in-house department. But before I let you speak, you have an alternative title that made me grin. What's the alternative title?
4 ways to crush in-house departments. But this was one of those cases where I didn't have your
discerning eye.
Such valuable input on titles, right? How would you title this thing? Because this is a pretty boring title, really.
Well, I'm interested in the thoughts behind, do we need to crush in-house departments?
No, I'm kind of kidding. We don't. In fact, I think that's kind of the way we used to think.
Yeah.
And it didn't serve us well at all. They were kind of the enemy to us, but we were the enemy to them too, because they didn't want the shit work. They wanted the fun stuff. And then on the big stuff, like back when you used to do annual reports, that got shipped out to you for $230,000 and they're just shaking their heads. Those days are gone. I mean, I haven't heard any kind of rumblings in the marketplace about that sort of competition staying, but there still are some old timers in the field that remember it and maybe have a little bit of roots in that.
Yeah, and I think as we've talked about before, I think there's a certain age cutoff, and I'm slightly above it, but I'm trying real hard to fit myself into the cohort beneath, and that is at some point, people younger than us, and maybe the cutoff is around 40 or somewhere, or maybe it's not there, I'm just imagining it, but at some point, people understand that it's just a more cooperative world, and it's not so zero-sum. So
right, yeah.
I think the better way and probably more accurate way to look at this is departments are here to stay, and we've got to find a way to work together. So the point of this episode is let's understand what advantages we bring to the table, and that's going to help us understand where we can add value and maybe some areas where we need to really just cede over to the in-house departments. You called it shit work. I mean, I used to refer the stuff that I didn't want to do in the business, I would call it the shit work.
Right.
And then somebody said to me, you can't call it that. It's only shit work to you. Other people love that stuff.
Yeah. Wouldn't a lot of the listeners here appreciate the role that in-house departments play? They're doing things that the agencies don't want to do sometimes, and they're also helping to build consensus internally and also give away sort of secret information to help wax the floors a little bit. So I agree. I shouldn't say shit work. I guess I'm kind of in a little bit of crazy. This could get dangerous. I'll say that.
Oh, excellent. These are the best ones. Okay, let's start by, you've got some sort of taxonomy of clients in terms of how they think about or use in-house resources.
I think the shortcut here is that there are, broadly speaking, obviously lots of exceptions, but broadly speaking, there are kind of 3 kinds of in-house departments. And I think it's useful to start by thinking about these different types of in-house departments and what kind of implications those bring. So first kind is the big Fortune 5,000 client that doesn't have any in-house department at all. They really need you. And because there's no in-house department, there's no middle person here. And so you are working usually with the decision maker. So large Fortune 5,000s, they have no in-house department. They're used to using you. Those are great clients. Okay. Second type would be the big clients who have a small department, or they could even be mid-size companies that have a small department. What I see is the small departments are sort of like between 1 and 5 people. And they really need you too, because there's just a lot of stuff they can't do and a lot of levels they can't speak to up high because they just don't kind of have the respect that you have as an outsider. The key there is to work with those departments and not be refused access to decision makers. So if you're working for a company that has a 1 to 5 person in-house department, you can't afford to be roadblocked right there. You have to be connected to people who are above that department and who are sort of the internal client. So that's the second. And the third, which is increasingly becoming the case, is the large internal department. So 6 to hundreds. I've worked with some clients that have 400 people in their marketing department. And that's anybody's guess. The stakes are really high. You almost need to be a bigger firm, or you're one of 8. You need to be able to speak at those board level sort of conferences. You need to defend. You also need to be very confident about your fees, because otherwise they'll just run you over, all the procurement stuff we've talked about. So no department, small department, or big department. And there's a future for you with all of these, but you sort of have to play the game a little bit differently. How do you hold your own?
I was going to ask you about which of these is better. It doesn't matter. Your relationship is whatever it is. You just have to find your place in it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I would say if you were asking that question of one of the big ad agency holding company members, they would probably only want to work for the last ones, the ones with really big internal departments, or maybe no department at all. I think for our clients, for our listeners, I would say the best clients are the ones that have a small department. I need to think more about that. I haven't thought too much about that question, but in my experience, when I look back anecdotally at the kind of best client relationships, it's not the ones who have big departments or no departments, but they have a small department. Have you thought about that?
No, as I'm thinking about it now, I don't know that I see an advantage. I think your point about the middle one, the small department, 1 to 5, as long as you still have access to senior decision makers, that seems to me to be the key for both the middle and the large.
Yeah.
Although with the largest ones, you're not. You're going to have access to the people at the top of that department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are marketing departments, and we don't think of marketing departments typically, or at least I don't, as in-house resources. It's when they have creative developers.
Video.
Yeah, that's when you start to think of these are in-house resources that are competing with us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, the topic is your 4 advantages over an in-house department. So judging by the title, there are 4 of them. Where do you want to start? I'm sharp today, baby.
How could I ever find a more perceptive podcast partner? The way you pick shit up is amazing.
I've laid the trap because you've miscounted. There are actually 5.
No, you're just trying
Just kidding. Let's go.
All right. Don't feel the need to jump into any other part of our discussion today, okay? Feel free to just take a nap. All right. So the first one is positioning. And I say that word like we've said that word a million times. People are really tired of hearing it. But I'm going to take a different approach on this. So we're talking about the 4 advantages you have. The first one, not in any particular order, but the first one I want to talk about is positioning. I am not talking about your public positioning. I am talking about whether you have taken advantage of being in front of many clients where similar things happen and you've noticed those patterns and you apply them to your work. That is happening. That sort of pattern matching is happening by some firms who are very poorly positioned, but they've seen this before. And it's also not happening by firms who are very well positioned in some cases. And a lot of people stop there. They figure out what's the right positioning, but it doesn't yield better work. It just yields a better marketing plan. And I'm talking about better work. I'm talking about the pattern matching that comes because you have seen this train before and you know where it's headed and you know how to get it back on track. And that's what I mean by positioning. They're sitting there. They know everything about their company. And I don't think you should promise to know more about their company than they do. I hear that silly promise a lot. What you should promise is that you're going to know more about their company than any other outside advisor, but you're never going to know more than they do. But you do know a lot about other companies that are like theirs, whether it's vertical or horizontal positioning, and they are hungry for that stuff. They're always asking you, hey, what do you find out there about this? And that's the stuff you bring to the table that they simply cannot do because their competitors are just not going to be that open with them. That's the first one.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking that's a great explanation of why branding for X, for say vertical market, is not really a positioning.
Yeah.
Because you do branding for a vertical. I don't know that there are patterns to spot in branding in a vertical. There are patterns to spot across multiple verticals, I suppose.
And if you say we focus in healthcare, well, okay, now you're 20% of the GP, like that's not very narrow. You could start to pick up a lot of patterns if it's narrower than that, right? Or just simply approaching your work very differently, asking very different questions and thinking, we're doing too much of this start and stop projects. We're not thinking enough about how our work for this client impacts our work for this client. It's happening accidentally, but we're not intentionally building up layer by layer, like reverse peeling an onion, insight that results from our positioning decisions. That's kind of another way to look at it.
Okay. And so you're saying your first advantage that you have over the in-house department, you called it positioning, but I have to admit, when I read it, I didn't quite understand it until you explained it. What you're really saying here is you're bringing a point of view that you've amassed from working with a bunch of different firms like this one.
Yeah, right.
So you are not the expert on this firm, but you kind of have some category, if you're positioned, focused in a category, you have some experience in working with, you're seeing broader patterns of whatever problem we, the client, might be facing at any one time.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're bringing that broader experience to bear.
You're an experienced advisor. You're not just an advisor. We've talked so much about positioning, I probably don't need to explain that. And really the point is, it's beyond public positioning. You've seen this so much. You're a conversational AI firm, and you've seen the typical problems to integrate this across 7 silos at these B2C companies. And you can speak to that out of the gate, which they can't do. All they can speak to is what they are faced with, and they can't see it in a bigger context.
Yeah, I'm imagining an agency owner who needs to hire a management consultant to help with, like, pick an issue, some sort of HR issue, or maybe it's a profitability issue. So they could go hire any number of management consultants, or they could hire you. And if they hire you, one of the things you bring to the table is, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, is what do you see in other firms like ours?
Yeah.
So that pattern matching across the category, our listeners need to understand that that's what you bring to the table in this situation. So while your in-house resources against which you're competing, they might have more depth of knowledge about, well, like, how things work in this company. They don't have the breadth across the category. They can't bring to bear this point of view on, well, here's what a bunch of companies in this category are doing. Here are the common mistakes. Here are the areas that the most progressive or advanced companies are beginning to explore. Here's some areas where these companies are getting into trouble.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that this is viewed as a partnership, because all the other things that people are doing, some of those apply and some don't internally, or they've tried some of those things, or there's some unique constraints or political or money or something like that, or regulatory. So that's why it's so important for you to have a partnership, but recognize how valuable your half of that partnership is.
Yeah, so you would see not only the patterns, you would have some sort of filtering mechanism for understanding which of these patterns apply to this client's business and which don't.
Yeah, and it's a feedback loop where you just get smarter and smarter and more useful to your clients.
Okay, so the first advantage is you're positioning as an expert in this space. It's not an expert in the client's business, but you see patterns in similar types of businesses, and you bring those patterns to bear in your role as an outside advisor. And then your second advantage, you've got courageous objectivity.
Yeah, in the last book I wrote, The Business of Expertise, ding, ding, a little push for that. You were wondering how long it'd take me to... There's an illustration in there where you have the client inside their own jar, and they're trying to twist their neck to read the label that's on the outside of the jar, but they're inside the jar. And that's exactly where your clients are, in that they can't read the label from the outside. And so what you bring to the table is this observational power that simply is impossible from the client's vantage point. Now, that's the first half of this courageous objectivity. That's the objectivity part. You also have to be courageous, or it's not all that useful. You have to be able to speak to their situation based on your external perspective. And even if they could read the label from the outside, they seldom can bring that courageous objectivity to the table, because part of the incentive system that makes these Fortune 5000s work is the notion of teamwork. And there's only so much you can press the envelope until you cross a boundary where they don't think you're a team member anymore, but you're just antagonistic. There are many conversations you've had where you have said something in a presentation to your client, and later on a break, quietly, somebody who works at the company comes up to you and says, you know what, I've been saying that same thing for 3 years, but they haven't been listening to me. So it wasn't an issue of objectivity at that point. It was simply an issue of listening to you differently, and then maybe the way you say it. There are a lot of realizations that occur at your clients that have to go unexpressed because they still need to retain this label of being a team player, or their advancement slows down. So it's the courageous objectivity, seeing things from the outside and having the courage to state them, because what's at stake for you is just not as good. In fact, what's at stake, if you don't speak to those things courageously, you're probably not going to be listened to. Part of your job security is to be a truth teller in that situation, even though it may feel uncomfortable.
That's a great way to put it. I come back a lot to the definition of creativity that I really like, which is creativity is the ability to see, to bring novel perspective to a problem. So if you think of that, if you are a creative person or a creative firm, that's your superpower. So you combine these two things, this outside perspective, which is the objectivity that you talked about, and the fact that you have this ability to think about things differently from the get-go. You have this doubled advantage. You can see things that others cannot. And then you've married to that the requirement to be courageous, to be a truth teller.
Right.
I think that's powerful. And one without the other isn't nearly as meaningful or as powerful.
This, I think, highlights something that I know you've been thinking a lot about, and that's what makes an effective account person. How does somebody grow an account? And I can tell you that an order taker who's sitting in the AM role is not going to be they could be objective, but they're not going to be courageous about that. That just highlights the importance of somebody who can not only see, but also speak to something without offense.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
All right, we're talking about your 4 advantages over an in-house department. Advantage number 1 was your positioning and the point of view that you gain from that positioning. Advantage number 2 was your courageous objectivity. What is advantage number 3?
It's really nimbleness. I don't have as much to say about this one, but I want to make sure that people don't misread that as speed to get things done, because even though there is some element of the value of getting things done quickly, and you certainly can work faster than they can, I'm really nervous about hanging my hat on that one. So I really mean nimbleness. I don't mean speed. By nimbleness here, I mean your ability to change direction quickly. Not so much to get things done quickly, but to change direction quickly. They have to overthink things. This is very much like the way the sausage is made in the political world. The fact that it seems so inefficient is what protects us all from stupid laws, even though they still make it through. In the corporate world, they really have to get a lot of approvals. They have to overthink things. The whole idea of a MVP, a minimally viable product, they don't even know what that means in that world, right? But you can turn on a dime, and at many times in the relationship, this will be the most valuable thing they get from you, is your flexibility. That's why I think it's important to think about the service offering side in a way that you can be flexible. So what I mean by that is the right kind of people that don't require all kinds of boundaries working on staff. It might mean having a stable base of contractors who are happy to pick up a short job and do something in the evenings, or whatever that means. I just think this nimbleness is important. There is not much nimbleness at that level. In fact, that's what attracts people to that world, is the lack of nimbleness. This is an advantage for you. You're a small ship, you can turn quickly. So that's the third one.
So that's primarily in a relationship where you're dealing with the larger companies, right? As they get larger,
right,
there's more bureaucracy. And as entrepreneurs and creative people, we tend to look at that word negatively. And I still think of it mostly as negative. But there's a reason why we have bureaucracy. It slows things down. So you think of a government, it inhibits the likelihood of any one individual making a mistake that will have a catastrophic effect on a whole bunch of us.
Right.
So it's hard to do things. So you get these larger companies that have a more bureaucratic culture. and they need to move quicker. They can't do it in-house, so they look to you. And there's something about your size and probably your culture too, is that what you're saying, that allows you to move more nimbly?
Yes, absolutely. They're the giant cruise ship, and you are the little battleship. And there's a lot of times when you're just not going to bring enough firepower, but there are a lot of times when they really need you to respond because you can turn quickly. This is not the most important of these four, and it's also one that kind of goes without saying. I just want to make sure that you're able to talk about this and able to think about it. And that's why I'm really in favor of not putting so much system in place so that it feels like a big company. Leave it a little bit looser. Leave it more flexible. Leave it a little bit more fun. This nimbleness thing is not the most important, but it is an element of why they want to work with you.
You know, when I think of my idea of the inefficiency principle, which is that innovation and efficiency are opposable objectives. You can't increase one without decreasing the other. I think about this, and I think of a large efficiency-seeking organization has a moment where it's like, we've got to innovate on something. And they just don't have the capacity to do that because culturally, the organization is way out towards the efficiency-seeking end of the spectrum. In theory, I'm just thinking out loud here, in theory, they would look to you or firms like yours, outside firms that are more entrepreneurial, are more nimble, are more innovative, and all three of those things are related, to give them that shot of innovation that they wouldn't be able to pull off so quickly or adroitly in-house.
Yeah, if we have this need for innovation, you're going to jump to it by tomorrow afternoon. They're going to put a plan together about how to be flexible. That's the difference.
And I don't want to belabor this point, but it's just springing all these different thoughts. When companies get larger, often they give up on R&D. Pharmaceuticals in particular comes to mind. I don't know why, but I'm sure there are many other categories. When they get really big, it actually becomes cheaper to buy other companies than it is to actually do your own R&D. And in some sense, I don't know why, but I see this parallel where large companies, when they need that nimbleness, that like quick thinking, let's pivot quickly, et cetera, I can see how that expertise just cannot reside internally, and you would have to go get it through your external partners like your creative marketing digital agencies.
I think that is exactly right. And the corollary to that is that some of the ideas that you give them, most of them will probably never see the light of day. But what actually does happen, the innovation that does happen, wouldn't occur without those initial steps with you. So you're impacting it even though it doesn't look like it. And I think the way you've described it is exactly right. I think that stuff needs to be talked about more. And you and I have talked a lot about process, which kind of makes everything more predictable and drawn out. But there's an asterisk there about how quickly we can respond nimbly to something that comes up. I don't know that you can talk too much about that. I think it's just when you have the opportunity to do it, they're going to see it very quickly, even though it wouldn't have hit them if you described this ahead of the time when they actually needed it.
I'm looking at your first three advantages that we've covered. I'm just kind of combining them in my mind, and I'm thinking of a situation back in my career where a guy I worked for, president of an agency, reached out to the president of a big publicly traded client that we had and basically said, I'm seeing these patterns in other spaces. I know you've got a problem. So he could see the patterns from the positioning, number one. Two, he brought out within himself this courageous objectivity. He brought his point to bear, and he basically said, hire us to help you on this. And the guy didn't in the end. We were already engaged to do something else, but he was so appreciative of it.
Mm-hmm.
This was the CEO of the company that we didn't really have regular access to, but he was really appreciative of the outreach. You think of what were his alternatives in that moment? Were his internal people, A, going to see the broader patterns, B, speak up, and C, have the ability to execute nimbly on what they thought should be done? No.
Right. Yeah, I think there's so much there. I don't know, maybe we should talk more about that at some point. And also, if we tie this to pricing, when they have a need for innovation, which should exist all the time, right? But when there's some special call for it, there is enough pressure behind this call to spend money. there's something happening. There's some justification to spend a little bit more money than normal. And so this can be very highly paid work as well because of its urgency.
Yeah. All right. The fourth on your list of 4 advantages you have over an in-house department is talent. I love this one. And there's some more depth here than I initially considered. So do you want to explain this one to us?
Yeah, in all fairness, I never really thought about this until you brought it up during one of our earlier recordings, and I've been thinking about it since then. It's like, oh yeah, I never really thought about that. The kind of people in the past, the kind of people that will work for an in-house department and the ones who would work for an independent private firm were very different, and there was very little crossover. There's now more crossover than before, but it's still attracting certain kinds of people. And what you mentioned back then that's really got me thinking is this idea that there are certain people that a big client has access to at an independent private agency that they would never have access to because those people would never work for them. You could think of some copywriter or some crazy software engineer or whatever, and they just would never work for them. And I think this kind of highlights the fact that your company is made up of specific people, and there's some element of who those people are that draws them to your world, not just to your firm, but to the fact that it's not on the client side. I don't really know how to sell this, and I'm not even suggesting you put these 4 things on your website. I'm just saying, in your mind, always bring this up. Always think about it to yourself. And this last one is really interesting to think about because it should impact the kind of people you look for. Not everybody you have working for you should be only suitable for working in an independent firm. That'll be a lot of strange people. But it should be an element of this. Because if you could picture them going to work for IBM or something, how are you going to match that salary? It's also related to money too. These people need to be working for you, not just because of the money and the culture and so on, but because they get to do things that they would not get to do on the client side. And that is a competitive advantage for you.
One of the things I love about this business that you and I serve is it's just home to all the freaks and the weirdos. I live in this little remote mountain village in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things I think about this all the time about this place is if you feel like you don't have a home anywhere else in the world, you probably belong here. And I feel the same way about the creative industry and the independent agency in particular. Even within the creative firm space, I've heard stories of firm gets bought by a holding company, I'm out. People just leave. There's no way I'm going to work for a bigger ad agency or a company that owns an ad agency.
Yeah.
The first agency I ever worked in, it was owned by a really conservative owner. And he had this thought one day, and it was before I arrived. And his thought was, I think everybody should wear ties. And then somebody on his team said, well, you own the firm. If you want everybody to wear ties, you just tell everybody they've got to wear ties. So he passed this law. And immediately, it was a small firm. I think there was like 20 people in the firm. The next day, like 2 people in the creative department quit. And I thought, good for them.
Even the bookkeepers are interesting in this field, and that's not true anywhere else.
So again, back to this idea of the inefficiency principle is a cultural thing. And culture is kind of the answer to the question, like, what do we do when nobody's looking?
Right.
I forget who I stole that from. Maybe it was Seth Godin. I don't know. But you have an understanding from the culture, how we decide on these certain decisions in certain situations.
Yeah.
So in an efficiency-seeking culture, we're not taking a lot of risk. We don't incur a lot of waste. We do things as quickly and as wastelessly, is that the word I'm looking for, as possible. But in an independent creative firm, it's like, we don't think about that. We rebel against doing our timesheets, if there are timesheets at all. And it attracts people with a high propensity for risk. I'm reading your notes here. Rebellious risk takers, hungry learners, never satisfied. So if I own an efficiency-seeking organization and I all of a sudden need like some risk takers to move quickly, to think innovatively, et cetera, I just don't have that talent internally, because if I ever had the talent, they were either assimilated, I rewired their neurons through the culture, or they left.
Yeah, right.
Right. So the only way I'm going to go get that type of talent, if I can hire that type of talent, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to make them like everybody else. There isn't really a home for that type of talent in a large efficiency-seeking organization. So if I'm the CEO of that company, when I need access to that talent, I have to accept that I've got to go hire an independent firm to bring it to me.
Yeah, and if you're trying to hire those people who are going to be the rebellious, extra time thinkers and nonconformists, then don't come whining to me when they're hard to manage too, because that's who they are, right?
And they insist on a desk made out of Lego.
Yeah, right. And not wearing a tie, and they're not going to do timesheets. You can't have it both ways.
Casual Fridays does not mean drunk.
There's no new information in here, but I think it's kind of interesting to just take a pause here and say, keep in mind the advantages and play on these things as you talk in new business or you push back on clients and all that stuff.
If our podcast had a positioning statement, it might be, there's no new information in here. Okay, let me recap. We've been talking about your 4 advantages over an in-house department. Advantage number 1 is your positioning, or the benefits of your positioning, and that's the ability to match patterns and bring a point of view on what others in this space are doing. Advantage number 2 is your courageous objectivity, and as you pointed out, David, it's got to be both. You've got this objectivity from being an outside observer, but you have to bring the courage. Advantage number 3 is your nimbleness, your ability to pivot and change direction. And as you pointed out, it's not so much about speed, but kind of willingness and ability to change. And advantage number 4 is the talent. You are able to hire and retain the freaky people that do all the cool magic. And it's a lot harder for a client to be able to do that. This is a really good topic. I know you had your doubts before we pressed record about whether there was enough here. The nimbleness in particular, where I think you felt like you just wanted to go over fairly quickly. I hadn't thought about it all that deeply before. I think there's something kind of profound there, that as your clients grow larger, they lose that ability to be nimble, and you can be a provider of that.
Yeah, this has been fun. Good discussion, sir.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.